The morning had that washed porcelain clarity London sometimes grants as an apology for its fogs. Dolly Wren stood in Hermione's quiet flat and listened to the clock's respectful ticking as if it might translate the silence. The bed was smooth. That severe evening dress lay across a chair in an attitude of faint reproach, and the dressing table, set with ordered bottles, returned Dolly's anxious face without comfort. At 10:10, she replaced the receiver. No answer from the theatre. None from Lady Honoria's, and none from Miss Vale's maid, who ought to have been her if any of them had been doing what they always did. Dolly, who had never presumed, took her presumption between finger and thumb and rang Lady Honoria's butler. Swain, already in motion, received her inquiry as one more item upon a mental tray he kept perfectly level. "If Miss Wren will be so good as to come to Belgrave House," he said after a measured pause, "I believe Lady Honoria would be glad of her advice." He did not, of course, add the other item he had placed on that tray the moment the house had stirred. The gallery door had been found secure, the safe locked, and yet the morning felt minutely disarranged, like a tie set half a degree off-center. He went himself to the private gallery before summoning his mistress. It was a room that kept its hush even from the street's noises, its walls bearing their judicious burdens with an air of long endurance. He raised a blind. The light fell in a pale sheet across polished floorboards and up to the portrait of Hermione Vale, whose painted gaze received the day without surprise. Swain observed, as one notices the lapse of a minor ritual, that the small lamp beneath the far window was lit. He had switched it off at midnight. The detail placed itself on his tray. The chaise longue beneath the portrait had been drawn an inch or two forward. There was upon it a woman in black, composed in an attitude that seemed at first glance the natural punctuation of fatigue. The head inclined a fraction to the left, the hands, gloved, lay one upon the other at the waist, and the profile was correct. It was this correctness that gave Swain pause. He stood quite still, and into the stillness there crept the fine, scarcely perceptible wrongness that good servants recognize sooner than the rest of us. He advanced, not quickly, and spoke in the voice he might have used to wake a guest who had outstayed her nap. "Miss Vale." There was, of course, no answer. The skin that the morning light found was drained of its clever color. The mouth, known to play with meanings, had none now. Swain did not touch her. He stepped back to the bell, rang it once, and when a footman arrived, he said, "You will ask her ladyship to come at once. Tell her only that Miss Vale is here and unwell." Lady Honoria entered with the brisk economy of someone who has long practiced composure. She stopped at the curve of the chaise, and the habit of a lifetime steadied her throat. "Oh," she said very quietly. "No." They looked, the pair of them, not as if at a catastrophe, but at an inevitability discreetly announced. Lady Honoria's eyes travelled, not aimlessly, but as if consulting old maps, the portrait above, the lamp, the slight displacement of the chaise, the fold of the dress at the knee. "Send for Dr. Bicknell," she said, "and Swain, do not have the household alarmed. We will close the gallery doors and ring the police." She hesitated then, the distance of a breath, and Swain saw that she had thought of the safe. He had already thought of it. He went with her into the study. The safe yielded to her hands. The emerald bracelet lay precisely coiled among its companions, very green and very silent. Lady Honoria regarded it with an expression that was not astonishment, but memory. By the time Dr. Bicknell arrived, with his mild, dependable face, a figure had appeared at the front door that neither Lady Honoria nor Swain had summoned. Felix Arden, whose note, delivered early, had begged leave to call and fetch a misplaced script. His presence in the hall when the doctor passed was one more misaligned detail. He was admitted no farther than the morning room, where he was given coffee and nothing else. He did not drink it. Dolly Wren came a little after, breathless, her good hat slightly awry. Lady Honoria met her at the threshold of the gallery. "Dolly," she said, and the use of the Christian name let Dolly understand. She came forward a step and stopped, hands incarcerated in her purse. "She looks like her picture," she said, and began carefully to set her hat straight. Dr. Bicknell, having done what such men do in such rooms, closed his bag. "It is recent," he said to Lady Honoria, low-voiced. "There is no mark I can see. The authorities, of course." "Yes," said Lady Honoria. "Yes, of course." In the house's hush there passed the briefest flutter of something almost audible, like a page turned in a book one has read before. The telephone was brought. A call was made, and somewhere, beyond Belgrave Square's pale morning, a machine began to move with that particular quietness reserved for moments when the noise would be indecent. Inspector Roderick Alleyn arrived at Belgrave House with that particular unobtrusiveness which causes doorways to accept one more presence without noticing. Swain, grave and immaculate, received him as if admitting a discreet consultant in matters of atmosphere. Behind them, Inspector Fox moved with his large, comfortable silence, a presence that seemed to make rooms steadier. Lady Honoria, composed to the point of astringency, guided Alleyn to the gallery. "I prefer to tell you only what you require," she said quietly. "It seems more respectful to both of you." "Thank you," Alleyn replied. His voice had the mildness of someone refusing sugar he never took. The galleries. Pale morning light fell upon Hermione Vale with the steadiness of a judgment that neither accused nor forgave. Alleyn stood very still, allowing the scene to impress itself upon him, the chaise a whisper forward of its mark, the small lamp beneath the far window still burning with that furtive glow, peculiar to lamps left on in empty rooms. The faintest smell of stale perfume floating above the cold air, like a memory unwilling to be dismissed. He considered the portrait on the wall behind her, Maurice Kent's elegant trap. Paint had the effrontery of immortality. The painted Hermione looked past the real one, as if already engaged elsewhere. Fox, waiting, made a respectful note of positions without intruding. Dr. Bicknell, stout, competent, and already a little impatient with the mechanics of officialdom, cleared his throat. "If you have seen all you need at first glance, Inspector," he murmured, "I will say that whatever the exact cause, she died quietly and not, I fear, painlessly. Several hours ago, certainly. Midnight to 3, if you press me." "I won't," said Alleyn. He inclined his head towards Swain. "Mr. Swain, you found the lamp lit?" "Yes, sir. I extinguished it last night after seeing the guests out. This morning it burned again. I observed, too, that the chaise had shifted. It is my practice to align it with the central seam of the rug." Alleyn glanced down. The carpet's nap showed a pale, bruised line where the chaise had rested before. On the lacquered side table beside Hermione's hand lay nothing at all, an invitation to imagine what had been there and was now not. His gaze slipped to her pearls. Their clasp sat at the nape, slightly askew, a dusting of powder gathered in the joins. "Miss Vale's bracelet?" he asked, without looking away. "In the safe, sir," Swain replied. "Placed there by me at her ladyship's instruction last night. The safe was locked and remained so." "Good," said Alleyn, as if the word might, like a draught against a door, keep further disarray at bay. He moved nearer. The black crepe had lost its evening suppleness. One glove was fractionally twisted, the fingers set with the delicate orderliness of one who has been taught to arrange herself even at rest. At her feet, the faintest sprinkle of something, powder or dust, suggested a recent disturbance of the skirting panel. He filed it with the lamp, the chaise, the clasp. "Windows?" he asked. "Latched, sir," said Fox, who had already checked them. "No scarring on the frames. The key to the gallery door is kept by Mr. Swain and her ladyship. No other set so far as we are told." Lady Honoria's hands, folded very properly, showed no tremor. The house was secured at 1. Swain and I made a final tour. You did not come in here again after that, Lady Honoria. I did not. And Miss Vale, did she have the habit of returning after such an evening? She did. Not have the habit of doing anything twice, Lady Honoria said, with a dryness that did not disguise a flicker of grief. Alleyn allowed himself a slow survey of the room's edges, the discreet electric panel for the gallery lighting, its switch at off, the solitary lamp at on. A faint oval on the console's polished surface where something had rested overnight, then been lifted. He neither pointed nor touched. Observation, at this stage, asked only to be exact. "Doctor," he said at last, "we won't delay you. Fox, we'll have the scene photographed and preserved. Mr. Swain, you will be so good as to see that no one enters this room without permission." Swain inclined his head, a butler's acceptance of a command that mirrored his own instincts. "In a little while," Alleyn added, turning to Lady Honoria, "I should like to sit quietly with you and hear how last evening unfolded. Not an interrogation, merely a matter of making a small map." "Maps," she said, "have saved many lives, Inspector." "And occasionally a reputation," he returned, with a mildness that drew the ghost of a smile to her mouth. As they left the gallery, he paused at the threshold and looked back once, as if expecting the room to alter in his absence. It did not, but the impression of arrangement, of someone's careful hand upon the mise-en-scène, thickened like mist at dawn. In the corridor, Dolly Wren stood with her coat clutched to her, eyes too wide in a plain face that had learned discretion. Felix Arden had arrived and hovered at a distance, composed and theatrical even in silence. Crispin Loam, pale and attentive, watched the floor as if words might be written there. Alleyn greeted them with that courteous warmth which made men underestimate him and women forgive him, and thought, later, for now, he would let the house breathe. The questions could wait a half-hour. People, like rooms, revealed more of themselves when they believed no one was looking. Alleyn began with the courtesies. He had found that grief, when treated as a guest rather than a trespasser, disclosed more of its household. "Lady Honoria," he said when Dr. Bicknell had withdrawn and Fox moved, heavy-footed and gentle, to the far end of the gallery, "if you would be so good. Last night, the safe, the guests, and Miss Vale's departure." Her ladyship's hands, folded with precise economy, did not tremble. "At 11, perhaps a little later, we broke. I asked Swain to put Miss Vale's bracelet in the safe. She teased me, I'm old-fashioned about such things, and surrendered it with a little speech about talismans. The safe was locked. I walked the rooms as I always do. Swain extinguished the gallery lamp. We parted at the landing. You alone know the combination." "Myself and Swain," she answered after the briefest pause. "My solicitor keeps a sealed record. No one else." "Miss Vale left with whom?" "She refused my car, said the air would do her good. I fancy she preferred to be seen leaving triumphant." Lady Honoria's gaze moved against her will toward the still figure on the chaise. She was in odd spirits, moved, fiercely contained. She had that look actors wear when they've carried something dangerous across a stage and set it down without dropping it. Swain came at a discreet signal, the ghost of fatigue under his composure. Alleyn's questions fell with the lightness of rain on a polished terrace. Unhurried, impersonal, inevitable. "You locked up?" "I did, sir. I checked windows, extinguished the lamp, you observe, and secured the study. This morning at 8, I found the lamp burning and the chaise displaced. The gallery door was bolted on the inside." "On the inside?" Fox looked up, his pencil stilled. "A small barrel bolt, sir. We use it to keep drafts from playing tricks with the canvases. It can be drawn by one leaving or by one entering." Swain's eyes moved past Alleyn a fraction, as if considering the air itself for indiscretion. "But I found it shot when I entered, which was done by the master key." "How many keys?" "2, mine and her ladyship's." The safe? Neatly opened, no marks, only the bracelet missing. He added with a butler's guarded exactitude, nothing else disturbed. Not a paper, not a jewel case lid awry. Any visitor in the night? No, sir. A breath, not quite a hesitation. Unless one considers Miss Vale, who must have entered somehow. Alleyn allowed the pause to grow and settle. You had affection for her. Swain inclined his head. We all did, in our fashions. Dolly Wren arrived with the small, purposeful stride of a woman who apologizes by helping. Her hat was wrong for the hour, her eyes steady. I'm sorry to intrude, sir. They told me... Well, she looked once at Hermione and then not again. I was due at 10. You went to Cadogan Square. Yes, the bed hadn't been slept in. There was an evening dress across a chair, black crepe, but Miss often kept duplicates. She had 2 of that cut. One had a slightly heavier drape. I couldn't swear which I saw. Her stage bag was gone, the small one she takes for notes and scent and such. Her perfume bottle was corked. Dolly's capable hands folded, restrained. She never wore scent on stage, said it made emotions false. Did she have hydrocyanic acid in a cupboard? Fox asked bluntly, then regretted it. She had no truck with drugs, Dolly said, unoffended. Nerves she kept by work and hot milk. If poison was taken, it wasn't by habit. Her mood last night? Alleyn asked. High and thin, Dolly said, choosing precisely. As if she'd climbed somewhere and there was wind. She said nothing to me, only touched my arm when we pinned the hem. That's when I know she's thinking, when she's gentle. Alleyn moved through the gallery in a small, purposive circuit, registering what rooms declare to those who listen, the faint, bitter tang that hung and then vanished in the air currents. A minute's smear, darker than dust, at the edge of the chaise where a gloved hand might have steadied. The lampshade set a fraction askew as by a hurried palm. He touched nothing. Felix Arden, Mr. Crispin Loam, Maurice Kent, he said. They have been telephoned, Lady Honoria replied. Mr. Arden was at the theatre, as always at this hour. Mr. Loam sounded ill. Mr. Kent said he was on his way, in the tone painters use when they mean to arrive having already seen what they wish to paint. Very good, Alleyn said. He looked again at the portrait, and then at its mortal echo. We shall speak with them quietly, one by one. Swain's expression altered infinitesimally. It was not resistance, something more protective and less easy to name. Alleyn, who respected loyalty as both virtue and obstacle, merely inclined his head. Inspector, Lady Honoria said, is there anything you require at once? Only privacy and a little time, Alleyn answered. Truth dislikes a crowd and prefers routine. At this, Swain's lashes lowered as if a thought had brushed them. He said nothing. Fox, who missed little of such economy, made a small, exact note. The bell rang below, discreet as a conscience. Guests of another order had begun to arrive. Alleyn preferred, when possible, to conduct early conversations in rooms that had seen their owners at breakfast. He found people record themselves more completely among their own cups and letters. Lady Honoria's morning room provided exactly that setting. Muted chintzes, a coal fire coaxed to a civilized glow, a writing table with the day's correspondence set square. A maid had replaced the tea tray with coffee. The silver breathed discreetly. Forgive the intrusion, Lady Honoria, Alleyn said. We must ask at once who knew the combination to your safe. Only Swain and I, Lady Honoria replied. She sat very straight, hands folded as if she had rehearsed composure. My solicitor is aware of it in the abstract, but not the numbers. It is a habit of decades. Hermione did not know it. She asked you to place the bracelet there yourself. She did. She seemed... fretful is not the word. Alert, perhaps, to the possibility of mischance. I made light of it. Swain took it in my presence. Alleyn inclined his head. And before the house was closed? I walked with Hermione through the gallery. Maurice Kent's portrait. She stood before it longer than usual. I said good night at the stairs. She was to telephone for her car. After that, I cannot say. Fox, solid and unobtrusive, noted these particulars. Alleyn requested Felix Arden. The director arrived with a cultivated sorrow and the careful economy of a man who conserved drama for the stage. A catastrophe, he said softly. For the theatre, for art. Miss Vale was the axis upon which our little cosmos turned. When did you last see Miss Vale, Mr. Arden? At the party, of course. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. Triumphs are tiresome in detail, Inspector, and require the same speeches with minor variations. Then I left. One cannot hover upon the skirts of success. It wrinkles. Did you know of her request regarding the bracelet? Felix allowed a fraction of surprise to register. Her superstition? We all indulge one or two. Mine is punctuality. She had a fondness for talismans. The serpent suited her. Alleyn watched him for the faintest tightening around the eyes. There it was, quickly smoothed. And your relation with Mr. Loam? Felix's smile thinned. Authors are necessary. So are tailors. One prefers both to keep their stitches neat. Crispin Loam arrived next, pale and purposeful, his tie imperfectly knotted as if dressing had distracted him from breathing. Is it true? He asked, and then, catching himself, I beg your pardon. We are attempting to understand the movements of the last hours, Alleyn said. You and Miss Vale had one of those artistic disagreements that excellent plays provoke. Crispin's hands tightened on his hat. I spoke ill-advisedly at the party. She corrected me, decisively. I left before midnight. I walked. I do that when my head is full of ghosts. Did Miss Vale hint at enemies? Enemies? He managed a small, bitter laugh. We are all allies until success arrives. Then we become historians. Maurice Kent presented himself with the self-possession of a man accustomed to being both observed and forgiven. He regarded Alleyn with painterly interest, as if considering a new portrait. Your picture, Mr. Kent, hangs over her, presently. It was where she asked it to be, he said. She liked the angle of light. It is a vanity of mine that the light obeys me. You knew her well? Well enough to know that she guarded her truths with a performance. The bracelet, she treated it as a prop. The theater teaches such habits. Did she confide in you? Confide? No, but she allowed me to notice. That is a more discriminating gift. Charles Denby, summoned next, came with rawness barely tidied into formality. He had the anxious beauty of youth and the helplessness of a man who had meant to be useful and was not. I worshipped her, he said simply, flushing at his own word. Not in the vulgar way. She was what we all wish to be. You left when? After the toasts. Felix said we would meet at rehearsal. I walked her to the foot of the stairs. She smiled, kindly, but not as if she saw me. She sometimes did that, like looking through glass. And Miss Davenant? Lila Davenant entered carefully, as if each step might betray ambition. Her frock attempted elegance with courage and insufficient means, and her voice carried an almost vanished country cadence ironed into London flatness. I was there, Inspector, but I am nobody in such rooms. On the contrary, Alleyn said, nobody's noticed the most. She hesitated, then she touched her wrist when the bracelet went away, as if something had been taken from her that wasn't the jewels. She said luck was a childish word, but she said it as if she'd lost a child. Alleyn let the silence stand, and Lila, relieved, stopped. He thanked her. When they had all gone, the room returned to its correct dimensions. Fox closed his notebook. A tidy circle. Tidy circles conceal untidy centers, Alleyn said. He rose. Through the half-open door, he had already observed Swain's imperturbable figure, and, beyond him in the passage, Dolly Wren, with her cloak still on, hands tight in the fabric, watching like a mother at the school gates. They had stood invisible while their betters arranged explanations. "We will speak to the household," he said lightly, as if asking for another cup of coffee. When the silver is polished, the truth often shines uncomfortably. Alleyn preferred, when circumstances allowed, to speak first with those whose business was to observe without appearing to look. Swain stood in the small butler's pantry, like an officer at an advanced post, the silver safe behind him reflecting his measured calm. He had the unassailable propriety of a man whose discretion had been tested and found flawless. "Your routines, Swain?" Alleyn asked lightly. "Last night and this morning." "After the guests departed, sir, 10 minutes past midnight, I extinguished in order the sconces in the long corridor, the gallery lamps, save the standard by the north window, which I recollect switching off, then secured the front. I visited her ladyship's study to ensure the safe was locked. It was. His eyelids described the faintest dissent. I slept in the small room off the servants' hall for the sake of the early callers. At 6:30 I made my round. The standard in the gallery was alight. And the safe? Closed, sir. No visible disturbance. I did not open it until later, when Dr. Bicknell had been and your presence was anticipated. Alleyn let that rest. Who knows the combination? Her ladyship. Myself. A studied pause. The late Lord Honoria did insist once that Mr. Avery, her ladyship's secretary, be instructed in case of illness, but that was years ago. Mr. Avery has not used it since. Nevertheless, he knows it. I could not say, sir. Swain did not blink. Alleyn watched the man's hands. Not a tremor, rather a deliberate stillness that announced knowledge and drew a curtain over it. Did Miss Vale ever attend the study without her ladyship? Never unattended. The bracelet passed from Miss Vale to myself, thence to the bowl, thence to the safe. The bowl? Swain indicated a shallow silver dish on a side table. Her ladyship's practice, sir. Guests may lay their trinkets there momentarily to spare the indignity of fumbling at the study door. It comforts nervous visitors. They find the presence of silver persuasive. There was a humility to that word practice that suggested a ritual with the power to soothe and to conceal. Dolly Wren waited by the servants' stairs, hat in hand, as if ready to flee the instant civility gave permission. Her face had the crumpled look of a night not slept, yet her voice, when it came, was steady with the stubborn loyalty of an old retainer. "You had an arrangement, Miss Wren. Daily calls?" 10 o'clock sharp, sir. Her bag would be open, combs set out. She liked a dab of eau de cologne at the wrists, not scent, just that fresh sort. I kept a little bottle for her in my pocket, and the salts. She'd say, "Dolly, the air's gone," and I'd pass them, quiet-like. She never cared for drink, sir. Couldn't abide sweet liqueurs. Said they made one's mouth clumsy. Alleyn looked at her with mild interest. "Salts?" A tiny oval, worked silver. She said it steadied her. Sometimes in the wings, sometimes... Dolly stopped, unaccountably arrested by the memory of the gallery's measured hush. Sometimes anywhere if the air turned. Did she have it last night? Dolly's fingers closed upon the brim of her hat until the straw squeaked. "I couldn't say, sir." "You mean you won't?" A flicker of defiance, instantly extinguished. She was careful, Mr. Alleyn. That's all. Mrs. Patch, the housekeeper, received him in the still room with a kind of affronted orderliness that suggested tragedy had inconvenienced the calendar. Her ledger lay open at "Fires laid guests." She answered without embroidery. "The grate in the gallery was not lit last night. Her ladyship does not care for smoke about the pictures. The morning coal was put in at 6. I found the window a shade open. The little linen cloth on the side table had a crease not of my making. A crease, something set down and lifted again before it had learned its place." Mrs. Patch's eyes met his with the briefest spark of complicity. Also the Venetian liqueur glasses, 6 on the lacquer tray, were 5 at first light. At 7, 6 again. Was one used? I wash my trays before breakfast, sir. She folded her hands. One trusts one's own methods. Alleyn did not insist. He had caught, beneath the starch, the faintest recoil at a remembered odor and filed it away with Dolly's fresh sort and Swain's persuasive silver. Mr. Avery, the secretary, presented the neat anxiety of a man who arranges other people's lives to avoid looking at his own. His small office stood between the study and the library like a customs post. "You remained late?" Alleyn inquired. "Until the last motor departed. Lady Honoria desired me to telephone the morning papers. I left by the side door at 12:40. You have the combination?" Avery dabbed at his spectacles. "It was entrusted to me in Lord Honoria's time. I have not used it in years." "But you remember it?" Colour rose. "The mind keeps what it is told is important." "Anyone pass this way after midnight?" "No one, Inspector." The denial was prompt and insufficiently shaded. "That is, no visitor announced. There are passages. I do not presume to police them." Alleyn took the corridor alone back to the gallery, letting the house's quiet industry murmur itself into meaning. The polishing of a silver bowl, the resetting of a sixth glass, the comforting fiction that a crease irons itself. Routines had been disturbed and then, with care too deliberate to be innocent, restored. He stood a moment beneath the painted Hermione and the arranged one below. A household will never say what it knows. It will, however, do what it knows. That, he thought, would be enough. When the first round of conversations had been concluded, Alleyn asked, very mildly, to be left alone in the gallery. It was a request that in other hands might have sounded theatrical. In his it was merely courteous, with a hint of scholarly curiosity. The room accepted him as it accepts a conscientious cleaner, a presence intent on order rather than disruption. He stood quite still for a moment and let the place speak. The hush had the dry fragrance of polished wood and winter flowers. The portraits did their silent work. The chaise, advanced that suggestive inch or two, continued to advertise deliberation. The little lamp by the window burned with the meek insistence of a witness who will not withdraw a statement, however trivial. Swain's account of his nightly ritual had been precise. Lamps out, curtains drawn, grills fastened, gallery door locked, study safe secured, ledger signed. An economy of movement and conscience, yet certain things quivered against that pattern like misplayed notes. The lamp relit, the chaise shifted, and he moved to the stand beneath Maurice Kent's portrait. The lilies. Lady Honoria had a partiality for lilies in winter, finding them properly austere. Swain, who arranged them, would no more have altered their natural form than he would have trimmed a guest's coat. Yet these lilies had been deprived of their stamens with the neat efficacy of a practiced hand. No pollen, therefore, to smirch black crepe or pearls. A drawer yielded a paper of old theatre programs used for kindling. He lifted it and found, beneath, the faintest dusting of saffron where one stamen had fallen and been brushed aside. He remembered Dolly Wren's voice, quiet in its grief, practical in its content, speaking earlier of dressing-room necessities. "We always nip out the stamens if Miss is in pale or black. That stuff ruins a frock, in a blink." Dolly had added, with the dignity of a professional creed, that no dresser worth her pin cushion would forget it. He considered the quiet, efficient removal, contrasting it with Swain's reverence for the organic. Not Swain, then. Not Lady Honoria, whose aversion to the practical defacing of beauty was nearly theological. Someone whose life was measured by the inch and the stain. Someone for whom clothes were both armor and instrument. The gallery's chimney-piece bore a low dish of potpourri. At its rim, so faint as to escape any but a collector of small irrelevances, a smear of pale grease caught the light, cold cream or the ghost of it. Alleyn touched the smear with the corner of a handkerchief. The scent, rose and wax and something older, rose obediently. Grease paint's grandmother. Dolly again, perhaps. Or any woman of the theatre. But it had been left here, in Lady Honoria's gallery, where such perfumes were as foreign as footlights. He turned to the window. The curtains had been drawn last night, according to Swain, yet the tie-backs sat at unequal lengths. A small imperfection betraying haste or unfamiliarity. Swain's loops would have matched as soldiers match in drill. He pictured a figure approaching the tall windows in the after-midnight quiet, fumbling slightly at unfamiliar silk, then relighting the lamp because the light was needed for delicate work. In the study, Lady Honoria's safe sat discreetly behind panelling that announced its existence as unmistakably as a bishop announces his rank. At Alleyn's request, Swain had produced the ledger, whose entries, initialed, dated, timed, ran in a respectable column. The bracelet entered at 11:25. No entry until morning. Yet the bracelet had gone, and the dial of the safe bore, on its matte black, the faint crescent traces of powdered touch. He studied them. The pattern was higher than Lady Honoria's reach, lower than Swain's. A woman's hand, perhaps, or a man reaching awkwardly. He left it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. On the desk, a glass. One of Lady Honoria's delicate liqueur goblets rested upon a square of blotting paper. The butler would not have left such a thing overnight. Lady Honoria did not admit spirits to her solitude. On the rim, the whisper of colour, a choral tone, very slight, as if from a lip partially kissed by paint and wiped at once by habit. He set the glass back precisely where it had been. There was, too, a book left open, face down with the mild discourtesy of a tired reader. Dante, in translation. Lady Honoria's habit was to mark her place with a cut card. Swain's routine included rescuing face-down pages from ruin. He noted the card lying beside the book instead of within it. A night of small derangements then, routines bent out of shape to accommodate a stealthy purpose. Outside in the corridor, he met Fox, who had been conducting that steadfast trawl which makes a net of a house. Fox's report was characteristically plain. Swain confirms the study door was bolted at midnight. Bolt was slid back this morning. No marks. Cook swears no one came by the trade's entrance after 11. Chauffeur says the garage bell rang at 2. No, he didn't look out. Thought it was the wind on the wire. Alleyn considered. The wind did many useful services for the ungenerous, taking blame and leaving none. He glanced back toward the gallery, where the lilies, chastened and immaculate, kept their watch. It isn't the large gesture, he said half to himself, but the small kindnesses to fabric that give our visitor away. Someone who thinks first of the frock. He did not add, as his thought completed itself, and last of the woman. He asked, almost idly, whether any of the household ever wore coral on the lips. Swain, affronted at the intimate suggestion, allowed that her ladyship disapproved of colour and that Miss Wren, Dolly, had been seen with a practical, unbecoming stick one might call coral if one were charitable. But she would never, sir, in here. Of that the butler was quite certain. From the billiard-room a bell vibrated, not loud, but insistent. Lady Honoria's summons. Alleyn folded his handkerchief, slid it away, and moved to answer. The house was yielding, in its own language of routines lightly distorted, the first true sentence of its story. It remained to be seen who had written it and for what kind of audience. By late afternoon the air had altered. The raw edge of discovery had dulled into that quieter state in which people begin to behave as if life might proceed, if only provisionally. Alleyn, after a sequence of tactful conversations below stairs and a brief return to Lady Honoria's study, where a small deviation in routine troubled him more than any dramatic clue, walked with Fox into the dim well of the Apollo's auditorium. The house lights were at half. dust moved in slow galaxies through slats of stage light. The prompt bell had the melancholy authority of a monastery gong. A run-through had been called. Felix Arden sat 3 rows from the front, very upright, very composed, his program folded to a narrow baton across his knees. Crispin Loam occupied a seat behind him, the leather portfolio closed for once, both hands upon it as if it might otherwise escape. On stage, Lila Davenant moved through Hermione's opening scene with a docility that was not without intelligence. She had learnt every crossing, every pause. If it lacked that unmistakable vibration which Hermione had contrived even in silence, it possessed a clarity of intention which, in another play, might have been called virtue. Dolly Wren stood in the prompt corner, a coil of thread looped round one finger and a look in her eyes that combined pride with something very like fear. Now and then she would glance at the wing where, by habit, she had stood through countess performances, ready with shawl or glass or word. Old rituals pressed against the day like well-worn gloves on an unfamiliar hand. Alleyn, settled beside Fox at the aisle, let the stage speak to him as rooms had spoken all morning. The small economies, the unremarked invariants. At Belgrave House, Swain had not brought the 11:40 tea to the morning room. It had come at 11:32, carried by the under-footman, because Swain had been in the study precisely at the moment he was never in the study. Confirming for once with his own hand the safe's combination. Lady Honoria had said she had done it the night before. Swain, with quiet dignity, had admitted that he had allowed it, though he never allowed it. The grain of habit reversed. The stage door bell sounded discreetly. A boy, his cap at a diplomatic angle, proffered a buff envelope to the porter, who signed with ceremonial gravity and passed it to Dolly. She looked at the superscription and hesitated, then crossed to the wing. "For you, miss," she said very quietly. They brought it to the door. Lila took the envelope with both hands. The handwriting on the cover was neat without character, a careful anonymity. She broke the flap with the guarded motion of one braced for pain, and a small object, wrapped in tissue, slid into her palm. There was a whispered chime of metal against metal. Felix had risen and come 2 paces up the aisle, expression formal, almost priestly. "If you please, Miss Davenant," he said, and held out his hand. Lila looked from him to Dolly and then to Alleyn, who had reached the foot of the stairs. "Allow me," Alleyn murmured, and the thing lay a moment later in his gloved fingers, the serpent's head of an emerald bracelet detached from its body, its tiny hinged mouth catching the light with a sly glimmer. Beneath it, a narrow slip of paper, typewritten, bore 2 words. "For luck." The phrase, offered so lightly the night before, brought with it a disturbance distinctly colder than grief. Dolly made a small, involuntary sound. Lila's lips parted. Crispin closed his eyes as if against a noise only he could hear. Felix, after the slightest pause, too brief to register as hesitation, turned back to his seat and sat with the same upright composure, though the program in his hands now showed the fine tremor of strain. Alleyn studied the typing. The E had a faint shadow, the R sat a fraction low. There was a minuscule nick in the top of the key. Not evidence for a jury, not yet, merely the sort of particular that furniture and machines confide to those who listen. He did not look at Fox, but was aware of the slight shift of his substantial presence, that tiny settling by which the good inspector signified a general alert. "Stage business," Felix said at last, with a controlled lightness that fooled nobody. "A distasteful jest. We shall ignore it." "Perhaps we shall," Alleyn returned, his tone so mild that it seemed almost agreement. He slid the serpent's head and its little strip of paper into an envelope and gave it to Fox. "For the laboratory presently. And we will, if we may, keep the rehearsal undisturbed." The company, with the relief of children released from a held breath, resumed its marks. Lila moved again through Marina's first entrance, and if her voice now had acquired a new timbre, it was not entirely fear. Dolly watched her with the jealous attention of a mother adjusting to a second child. Crispin, motionless, seemed to be listening for something he did not expect to hear. On the page in his lap, a pencil lay untouched. In the outer passage, the boy's footsteps faded. The stage door closed with an almost apologetic click. The serpent's small head lay quiet in Fox's pocket like a token from an old game whose rules had been altered without announcement. Alleyn allowed his attention to unfocus, then to settle again. The quiet had been broken, not by outcry, but by a gesture neat as a signature. Somewhere, among these polished rituals, someone had thought carefully about luck, about talismans, about the persuasive eloquence of the almost familiar. He found, as sometimes happened at such moments, that his mind became very still, the better to register the dust as it settled. Toward evening, the house adjusted itself to a hush that was less grief than attention. Firelight took the authority from the windows and returned it to the room. The portraits seemed to recede an inch, as if polite enough to withdraw from human difficulty. Alleyn, who had a fondness for rooms that kept their silence intelligently, sat alone in Lady Honoria's morning room and permitted the day to settle in his mind like dust on polished wood. The proceedings since noon had been orderly to the point of discretion. Swain's account, neat as a butler's inventory, had yielded more in its omissions than its entries. He had mentioned, with an almost comic reluctance, that he alone had placed the bracelet in the safe and that only her ladyship knew the combination. He had not said, until prompted, that on rare occasions Miss Pruitt, Lady Honoria's companion, admitted tradesmen to the study for the signing of papers. He had not offered, until silence invited him, to remark that the small lamp in the gallery, which he always extinguished at night, had a failing switch that required a leftward touch he had not taught anyone. These curiosities carried the delicate fragrance of knowledge held back for the sake of a house's dignity. Dolly Wren, brought to Belgrave House by Lady Honoria's quiet insistence, had been practical and, in her way, exact. She had named the bottles on Hermione's dressing table at a glance, had identified the atomizer she used only just before an entrance and never after, had noted with a dresser's devastating certainty that the powder on the silver bowl, the bowl Swain had used to carry the bracelet, was not Hermione's brand. Not hers, she had said, and then stopped, horrified by her own competence. Alleyn, who admired unfussy minds, had thanked her without looking up from the faint bloom left by an unfamiliar hand upon the bright surface. The letter had appeared in the natural course of careful searching. A single sheet in Hermione's evening bag, folded once, typed in an ink that had known better days. It invited her, in Lady Honoria's tone without Lady Honoria's sentence music, to step back briefly after midnight, bracelet and a small alteration in the hanging. It was signed HQ, a contraction Lady Honoria had never employed in 40 years of social correspondence. Fox, with his unostentatious thoroughness, had already taken the Remington from the little writing table in Miss Pruitt's sitting room to the yard, along with a ribbon that shed its age lavishly. Miss Pruitt, quiet to the point of translucence, had accepted this as one accepts inclement weather. She had also, Alleyn noticed, corrected Fox when he misnamed a pigeonhole in Lady Honoria's desk, and then looked at her hands as if they were strangers. There had been, too, what one must call the second stirring. Maurice Kent did not present himself when asked. A telegram arrived to say he had been taken ill at Brighton. Swain, in the discreet manner of his kind, had observed that the local boy who brought the wire wore the look, not the livery, the look, of a theatre runner, and smelt faintly of size and stale paint. Fox, without being told, had gone to the stage door in pursuit of that smell. It was not dramatic, nothing in this business intended to be so, but the effect was of a curtain stirring where no draught should be. All these elements lay before Alleyn like tiles from different hearths, the safe opened by someone to whom the room was not quite second nature. The lamp coaxed into life by a leftward touch, learned perhaps by trial. The bowl kissed by a powder that was not the dead woman's. A letter that imitated a style but not a cadence. A painter taking seaside illness on the day his portrait acquired a fatal symmetry. He did not permit himself the comfort of a theory. That stage, with its peculiar exhilaration, remained for later. Instead, he allowed the temperaments to take on weight. Felix Arden, whose authority frayed at its edges when contradicted. Lila Davenant, who had spoken of purity of motive with an edge too bright for innocence. Crispin Loam, who loved an idea as some men love a woman and might forgive neither betrayal. Maurice Kent, whose painted understanding of Hermione looked, from certain angles, like possession. Miss Pruitt, whose translucence might conceal practicality as a lampshade does. And Lady Honoria herself, who managed her world with courtesy that could have bent iron. He rose and went back alone to the gallery. The evening had cooled the room. In that tempered light, the chaise' infinitesimal displacement, a matter of 2 inches forward, became more legible. He considered the ritual of Lady Honoria's nightly tour, the precise angle at which she drew the curtains, the way Swain left the little lamp as a point of civility for morning dusting. Whoever staged Hermione had understood the picture and the pose, but not the domestic grammar of the room. The effect was perfect, the syntax faintly foreign. Alleyn stood quite still until the portraits once more withdrew. Then he turned out the failing lamp with the leftward touch that had become a signature and went in search of Fox. There was work to be done at the theatre, and a question to be asked of someone who would answer it, he suspected, in silence. By late afternoon, the house had regained its cultivated quiet. The blinds in the morning room admitted a softened light. Small domestic sounds, china adjusted on a tray, the faint movement of coals, provided a rhythm of normality that felt almost deliberate. Lady Honoria had acceded to Alleyn's request for a small gathering. It was not, he had said, an inquest. Only a little clarity. They came in with varying degrees of composure. Felix Arden, pale and contained, took the chair that made his profile most effective. Lila Davenant sat slightly forward, fingers linked so tightly they blanched. Crispin Loam hovered, uncertain where to place his grief and his hands. Dolly Wren stood until Swain, with quiet authority, ensured she had a seat. Dr. Bicknell, who had agreed to remain if needed, positioned himself discreetly by the mantel, a figure of sober reassurance. The painter, Maurice Kent, had arrived at Lady Honoria's insistence and stood near the window, his eyes moving between his portrait and the space it now shadowed. Charles Denby slipped in last, hesitating on the threshold as if late for a call. Alleyn, who had chosen a place that allowed him to see faces without appearing to scrutinize them, regarded the group with courteous detachment. He was, in this setting, less official than cultivated. His voice, when he spoke, might have belonged to a man introducing a topic at dinner. "Thank you," he said, "for indulging a policeman's impulse to gather threads while the weave is still visible. We have, I think, arrived at certain points of agreement. Miss Vale died by a poison that works swiftly. She came here after the evening's festivities. She was arranged in the gallery, an arrangement informed by knowledge of her habits and of this house." No one contradicted him. The clock on the mantel-shelf declared a small, considerate chime. "It is also clear," he continued, "that she did not come by chance. A note, typed, brief, ostensibly practical, invited her to collect an item and discuss a matter touching the production. Its author used a signature that suggested safety. It was not written by the person whose name was borrowed." Lady Honoria inclined her head a fraction. Felix looked quickly at Lila. Lila did not look at anyone, at all. "Moreover," Alleyn said, "the safe was opened in the night and only one article removed. Miss Vale's bracelet. You all saw it yesterday. A serpent of emeralds, valued highly, but, like some of our more glittering possessions, valued for more than money. It was, I understand, a ritual object for Miss Vale. She removed it before a performance. She played better without it, or believed she did. Rituals, in such lives, become the scaffolding that keeps the facade erect. Dolly's eyes, fixed on her hands, flickered at this. Swain, expressionless, made a minute adjustment to the tea things. "It is my habit," Alleyn said gently, "to look for the place where ritual is broken. Not the obvious breaks. That is the theater of discovery, but the small, almost impolite disturbances. Here there are several. A lamp left burning, a chaise moved by an inch, a scent that does not belong in this room, an object that is never forgotten. Forgotten." He allowed silence to expand until it settled. When he resumed, it was with the same cultivated mildness. "I am not, for the moment, speaking of guilt in the legal sense. I'm speaking of knowledge. Someone here understands how Miss Vale came to sit so beautifully and so still beneath her painted counterpart. Someone understands why the bracelet was taken and what comfort or compulsion it represented. Someone understands the note." He looked not at the person he meant, but at Lady Honoria, whose calm, intelligent gaze met his with a recognition that did not ask for mercy and did not suppose melodrama. "If you please," he said, "we will do this quietly. Mr. Arden, Miss Davenant, Mr. Loam, you will forgive me if I ask you to wait with Mr. Fox in the library. Dr. Bicknell, if you would remain near. Mr. Kent, Mr. Densby, your patience a little longer. Swain, perhaps you might close the door. Thank you." Chairs moved softly. The library door murmured and settled. What remained was a smaller composition. Alleyn, Lady Honoria, Dolly Wren, who had not been asked to leave and seemed both startled and relieved by it. Swain, impassive as good silver, and the painter, whose presence Lady Honoria indicated with a slight gesture. The air, no longer diluted by many breathings, acquired a finer edge. Alleyn turned the small leather case he had placed on the table earlier so that its worn monogram faced Dolly. "This was found where it ought not to have been," he said, "where it could be both seen and not seen, a curious compromise like a conscience that wishes to confess without speaking." Dolly's breath caught, almost a sob, almost a cough. Swain's eyelids lowered, not in reproof, but in acknowledgement of a rule being gently, properly broken. "We will, if you consent, attend to truth before we attend to crime," Alleyn said. "It is possible that the former will render the latter tolerable." He rose. "Miss Wren, will you walk with me to the gallery?" They were gathered again in Lady Honoria's morning room, where the discreet tick of the French clock suggested order in a world that had briefly forgotten it. The coal fire burned with an obliging steadiness. Swain moved once to adjust a curtain and then withdrew, leaving Alleyn with the small company whose names had threaded the inquiry. Lady Honoria herself, composed and pale. Felix Arden, very still. Lila Davenant, attentive as a pupil. Crispin Loam, with his portfolio clasped like a shield. Dolly Wren, steady-eyed. And Maurice Kent, whose painter's hands worried at an invisible brush. Alleyn remained standing, his fingers lightly upon the back of a chair. Fox sat unobtrusively near the fireplace, a reassuring presence. "We have, I'm afraid, come to the end," Alleyn said, his voice courteous, almost apologetic. Dr. Bicknell's analysis confirms what he suspected in the gallery. Hydrocyanic acid, delivered in a small draught. Ngaio can be an obliging accomplice. Its polite almond note conceals much. Lady Honoria inclined her head. "The decanter in the little side press near the gallery. I recall ordering it for winter receptions. It had been disturbed after Swain's last round. The empty glass we found upon the far sill bore minute traces. It was not an impulsive offering." Alleyn's gaze passed over them, resting at last upon the portrait by Maurice Kent that watched from the wall with its elegant foreknowledge. Nor, I think, was the arrangement of Miss Vale's body. Someone who knew her, knew the theatre, composed that final picture with a director's exactitude. The chaise moved by inches, the light left burning to model a cheekbone, the face turned very slightly to meet her painted likeness. Felix's hands, those controlled, expressive hands, remained folded. Only a tendon quivered. The theft of the emerald bracelet, Alleyn continued, seemed at first an absurdity. If one wished to simulate robbery, why take nothing else? Why a single piece, and that one? The answer lay, I think, not in value, but in symbol. Miss Vale called it her talisman. To remove it was to complete a gesture, like cutting a final line. He turned to Lady Honoria with a small, apologetic smile. Your safe, ma'am, is a model of discretion, but habit, that excellent servant, can betray. You stand always to the left when you adjust the dial. Above your desk hangs that pleasing convex glass. Its lower edge bore the faint mark of a forefinger, as if someone had steadied themselves to study a reflection. From the far chair one might read a number or two, not all, perhaps, but enough for a mind trained to sequences. Lady Honoria's hand, resting on the arm of her chair, stilled upon the lace. We found, too, Alleyn said, a typed note, arranging the midnight conference in the gallery. It purported to be from you, madam, and named Swain as the admitting party. Miss Wren, who has kept her counsel admirably, allowed me to see the envelope. The type coincides with the machine in Mr. Arden's office, the worn E and the bruised R. Felix lifted his eyes. They were very pale. Theatre offices are not precisely sanctuaries, Inspector. Everyone sits at my desk. Certainly, Alleyn agreed amiably, though only one among us rehearses with furniture. Only one adjusts a seat by degrees until it obeys a line. Only one would think to angle a lamp, not for comfort, but for effect. And only one had spoken this week of perfection as if it were a private grievance. Crispin emitted a small, unlovely sound. Lila's breath caught and was stilled again. I do not think, Alleyn went on, almost conversational, that you intended a struggle. You wished to preserve what you had built. Miss Vale, who questioned, who appropriated, had, perhaps, ceased to be malleable. You lured her with a promise of privacy. You poured for her. A thimbleful, darling, for courage. And when the moment came, you arranged what you could best understand. A picture. You took the bracelet because you couldn't leave well enough alone. You always needed one gesture more. Felix glanced briefly at the portrait, then at his hands. She would have destroyed it, he said, not in anger, but with a director's weary certainty. Night after night, she had begun to play it against the grain. My play, my staging. I made it out of air, Inspector, and she would have made it into herself. Lady Honoria's voice, when it came, was level. And so you made her into a picture. Felix looked almost grateful for the phrasing. Yes, exactly that. There was no struggle in the room, only the quiet rearrangement of air after a declaration. Dolly Wren's mouth trembled and firmed. Crispin's portfolio sagged to his lap. Lila, after a moment, looked down at her folded hands with something like pity. Maurice Kent stared at his own painted woman and seemed not to know her. Alleyn inclined his head the merest fraction. Mr. Arden, we will go now. There is a little matter of statements. Inspector Fox will attend to the formalities. Felix rose. Will you allow me my coat? Of course. When they had gone, the clock resumed its quiet precedence. Lady Honoria's eyes were on the convex glass above her desk, where the room bent itself into a pale, obedient oval. It is an odd thing, she said at last, how art reveals and conceals in the same stroke. Yes, said Alleyn. It can be made to do either, or both. They took him without fuss and with a scrupulous regard for dignity. The theatre was empty of patrons, holding only the muffled sounds of a piano marking time and the shiver of dust in a shaft of pale afternoon light. Alleyn had chosen the interval between rehearsed scenes, when the stage was a borderland and the company, for once, silent. Felix Arden looked not so much defeated as abruptly unoccupied, a man whose hands had been made suddenly useless. He heard the charge with a slight inclination of his head, his pale eyes searching Alleyn's face for the possibility of reprieve and finding only courtesy. "If it must be now," he said, very low. "It must be now," Alleyn answered. "We'll go quietly, Mr. Arden. You'll have every opportunity to speak with counsel." Felix's gaze moved in an involuntary sweep to where Lila Davenant stood at the edge of the wings. She had put on Hermione's rehearsal dress, the second-act muslin that managed innocence with calculation, and was holding her breath as if air itself had become treacherous. He did not address her. Instead, he turned back to Alleyn with a small, almost grateful nod. "I suppose I preferred arrangement to accident," he said. "It was always my failing." Fox stepped forward with that particular tact which renders official business almost humane. There was no resistance. Felix relinquished his keys, the stage door, the property cupboard, and one silver case, which Fox receipt-booked with bureaucratic calm. The atomizer had already been taken into evidence. So too the bracelet, recovered from a velvet envelope in Felix's top drawer and identified with a slight tremor of distaste by Swain. "You will find," Felix said, not to plead, but perhaps to tidy the scene, "that the safe's little riddle was no riddle at all. People of position are sentimental about dates. We are all, in our fashion, predictable." On stage, Crispin Loam sat very still on a rehearsal chair and stared down at his script. He had spent the morning writing a new stage direction for a scene that would never be played as he intended. When Alleyn's eye met his, he lifted one shoulder in that small, helpless movement of an artist discovering that the instrument he has tuned cannot hold its pitch. Lady Honoria received the news in her morning room, her hands folded upon a paper knife as if it were a modest scepter. She closed her eyes briefly, not in prayer but in composure. "I shall have the portrait taken down," she said. "It is not, I think, a time for representations." "Perhaps not, your ladyship," Alleyn replied. "For some, the painted version is too generous." Swain waited at the threshold. "Inspector, shall I restore the emerald to the safe?" His voice retained its exact measure. "For the present," Alleyn said, "no. We'll keep it where it can do no further harm." Dolly Wren, summoned to collect Miss Vale's personal things, moved about the star's dressing room with the neat efficiency of grief converted into duty. She paused once, her palm resting on the pearls, and then, with a sigh that was almost a scolding, wrapped them in tissue. She wouldn't have liked untidiness, she said to the air. Not even now. Lila came to Alan as the company dispersed into whispers. "Will he? Must there be a trial?" "Yes," Alleyn said gently. "The law must have its turn." She nodded, taking this like a line she had known she would be required to speak. "Then I shall go on, tonight. I don't know if I can, but I shall." A faint, bitter smile touched her mouth. "It's curious, isn't it, Inspector, how the words demand to be said even when one no longer believes them?" "Words," Alleyn said, "and silence. Each has its place." As Felix was led away, he glanced once up into the flies, where the ropes hung in their orderly skein. "Cue the blackout," he murmured, not for effect but as reflex. A director's last instruction to a world that no longer took his cues. Outside, the October light held, fine and pitiless. In Belgrave House, the gallery waited in altered balance, the chaise restored to its precise position by Swain's measured hands, the small lamp properly cold, the portrait's absence speaking more eloquently than its presence. Justice, in its formal dress, had begun its measured approach. Whether it could do anything to amend the matter of Hermione Vale's vanishing was another question, and one that Alan, standing in the quiet of the wings and listening to the piano, find its key, knew would not be answered by magistrates or juries. They gathered again in Lady Honoria's gallery at the hour when afternoon light turns portraits into confidants. The chaise had been restored, the little lamp extinguished. Alleyn stood beneath Maurice Kent's canvas and let the room settle. "Mr. Kent," he said, "Sergeant Fox admired your studio this morning, the small dark room at the back. Useful for your reference photographs. One bottle from the shelf is missing." Maurice's hands remained elegant and still. "Things vanish in studios, Inspector. Cleaners, models. Not, I think, potassium cyanide." Alleyn's voice was courteous. "You have used it for wet plate experiments. Fox found its print on the wood of your easel." No one spoke. Swain waited a pace behind Lady Honoria. Lila sat with Dolly's capable hand upon her wrist. Felix watched the carpet as if reading cues. "The letter that recalled Miss Vale here," Alleyn went on, "was typed on a machine with a fatigued E. Yours writes so. It invited her to see the portrait in dawn, the truest light. She came. She always came when summoned by her reflection." Maurice's mouth moved almost to smile. "She was punctual." "In an empty room," Alleyn said, "she took as habit a pastille from the silver box in her bag. Dolly missed 2 today. One had been dusted with cyanide. Prussic acid acts within a minute. There would have been no outcry. Then the artist corrected the composition. The chaise advanced by 2 inches. The small lamp was lit to lift the values under her chin." He paused, not for effect, but to let the realignment be felt. "You opened the safe and took the emerald bracelet." Swain, whose loyalty requires the precise question, remembered that you are the only guest he has seen open that safe. Lady Honoria was once on the telephone. You fetched the bracelet to sketch it. You remembered the numbers." Swain inclined his head, the smallest admission in the world. "The bracelet completed the line," Maurice said softly. "It snakes the wrist. Without it, the truth is nearly right, which is worse than wrong." "Miss Vale had told you she might sit for another painter," Alleyn said, almost gentle. "Or she meant to dispose of the portrait in a manner you disliked. You heard, in either case, the extinction of your authority. You wish to possess what cannot be possessed, so you fixed her." Maurice's eyes met his. They held neither plea nor protest. "I did not mean to kill her here," he said, "only to choose the hour. I thought at home, perhaps." She was early. "And you were exact," Alleyn answered. "Exactness can be a dangerous mercy." He stood aside. Fox came forward with a restraint that honored both house and culprit. Kent looked once at the painted Hermione, and then, obeying some inner rule of composition, lowered his eyes and offered his hand. When they had gone, the room exhaled. Lady Honoria closed her fan. "Poor Maurice, poor child," she said. It was not entirely clear to whom the second pity belonged. "Art," Crispin murmured, bitterness half spent, "is an indecent alibi." Felix, very pale, said nothing. Lila sat very still, as if learning a new kind of silence. Dolly, with an instinct older than theatres, adjusted the shawl on the chaise and smoothed the air. Alleyn looked up at the portrait. It had lost nothing and gained a peculiar honesty. Images, he thought, hold us because they do not change. People are less obliging. Outside, the autumn light withdrew by delicate degrees, leaving the gallery to its ordered shadows. Swain drew the curtains. Somewhere, a clock made its quiet decision about the hour. Alleyn, who distrusted endings, allowed this one to stand and took his leave with the sense, not triumphant, not defeated, that a performance had closed upon the line it deserved.